The 25th of November marks the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It's a day when...
For years, Camilla stood beside King Charles, wearing her crown with grace. But what happened when the cameras stopped rolling? What did she do when no one was watching? Now, her former staff are finally speaking out. They're sharing secrets from behind palace walls, moments the public never saw. "We couldn't believe what we witnessed," one former aide whispered. These revelations paint a picture of Camilla that might surprise you. She wasn't always the polished royal we see on television. In private, something very different was happening. What her staff discovered will change how you see the Queen forever. Camilla's hidden truth. The palace staff saw everything. They always did. And what they saw in Camilla was not simply a queen adjusting to her new role. It was a woman wrapped in layers upon layers of carefully constructed protection, each one designed to shield something vulnerable beneath. She moved through the corridors with measured steps, neither rushing nor lingering, as if the very stones beneath her feet might judge her presence. Her face remained composed, pleasant even, but her eyes told a different story to those who dared look closely enough. The private rules she enforced were subtle but absolute. She preferred certain staff members, those who had served long enough to understand the unspoken boundaries that surrounded her. When she entered a room, conversations stopped, not from royal protocol alone, but from something deeper, an awareness that she mandated control over her environment in ways other royals did not. Her tone remained polite, always polite, but there existed an edge beneath the courtesy, a firmness that made clear which topics were welcome and which were forbidden territory. She asked questions about household matters with genuine interest, yet deflected anything personal with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of evasion. Staff members began to notice how she managed expectations without ever raising her voice. A certain look could communicate displeasure more effectively than words. A gentle suggestion carried the weight of a command. She created an atmosphere where loyalty was rewarded and curiosity was discouraged, where those who served her learned quickly that discretion was not merely appreciated, it was mandated. The servants who had initially approached her with hopeful enthusiasm gradually adjusted their attitudes, becoming more formal, more cautious, more aware that the woman wearing the crown was also wearing armor. Then came the night that changed everything in the eyes of those who watched. It was not a dramatic moment, not a scene from a film or a scandal that made headlines. It was simply an evening when one of the household staff, bringing tea to the private sitting room, noticed something different in Camilla's posture. She sat alone in the dim light, her back rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When the servant entered, Camilla's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The practiced smile returned, the gracious acknowledgement, the pleasant inquiry about the servant's family. But the transformation was too quick, too complete, like watching someone pull on a mask they had momentarily set aside. From that night forward, staff observed a heightened guardedness in her, a constant vigilance that suggested she was protecting something precious or hiding something painful. She became more controlled in her movements, more watchful of who entered her spaces, more particular about when and where she could be approached. The inner storm that raged within her had learned to wear perfect stillness on the outside. The private conversations multiplied. Behind closed doors, Camilla held meetings that no one else attended, discussions where even her most trusted staff were dismissed before a single word was spoken. She would retreat into certain rooms with visitors whose identities remained carefully obscured, and afterward, she would emerge looking drained, as though these encounters cost her something vital. The palace hummed with speculation, though no one dared speak their theories aloud. What could a queen possibly need to discuss in such absolute secrecy? What truths mandated such extraordinary privacy? But perhaps most telling was what she avoided. There were rooms in the palace she never entered, portraits she walked past without a glance, names that caused her expression to freeze when others mentioned them carelessly. Anything connected to the past, specifically to one particular past, seemed to activate an instinct in her to flee or deflect. She had perfected the art of changing subjects, of redirecting conversations, of simply not hearing questions she did not wish to answer. The staff noticed which photographs never appeared in her private quarters, which historical references made her stiffen almost imperceptibly, which anniversaries passed without acknowledgement. It was as if she was systematically erasing certain memories from her daily existence, trying to rewrite history by simply refusing to look at it. She wanted some things forgotten, buried so deeply that silence itself might eventually kill them. Yet the very intensity of her avoidance suggested the opposite effect. The more she tried to escape certain memories, the more present they became in her absence, like shadows that grew longer the harder she ran from the light. What memory haunted her so deeply that even silence could not bury it? The assistant who saw too much. Elaine approached her new position at the palace with excitement and reverence, imagining herself as part of something magnificent, something historic. She had no idea that the woman she would serve would challenge everything she believed about loyalty, discretion, and herself. The first day shattered her expectations like glass hitting marble floors. Elaine arrived at the palace gates with her heart racing, her hands smoothing down her carefully chosen outfit, her mind rehearsing the respectful phrases she had practiced. She had watched Camilla on television countless times, admired her composure during public appearances, and appreciated the grace she showed, despite the difficult circumstances that had marked her path to becoming queen. Elaine expected to meet that woman, the poised, charming figure who smiled warmly at crowds and spoke with measured elegance about charitable causes. Instead, she encountered someone entirely different behind those palace doors. The public Camilla vanished the moment the cameras disappeared. In private, the queen moved with sharp efficiency, her eyes assessing everything and everyone with an intensity that felt almost predatory. During their first meeting, Camilla barely looked at Elaine directly, yet somehow managed to communicate complete awareness of her presence, as if she could see through skin and bone into the very thoughts Elaine tried to hide. The contrast was so jarring that Elaine felt dizzy, wondering if she had somehow entered the wrong room or misunderstood her assignment entirely. "You seem nervous," Camilla had said, her voice pleasant but carrying something underneath that made the observation feel like an accusation. "Just honored to be here, Your Majesty," Elaine had replied, hating how her voice trembled. Camilla had smiled then, but the expression never reached her eyes. "Good. Nervousness can be useful. It keeps people careful." The orders came in whispers, never shouted commands or formal instructions. Camilla had perfected the art of making requests that felt like casual conversation, yet carried the weight of absolute requirements. She would mention something while arranging flowers, her tone light and conversational, but Elaine quickly learned that these offhand comments were actually precise directives that mandated immediate action. A simple, "I wonder if anyone has thought to contact so-and-so," meant Elaine wanted to make that contact within hours. A thoughtful, "perhaps certain people shouldn't be bothered with every little detail," meant specific information wanted to be filtered, hidden, or redirected away from particular royals. What unsettled Elaine most was how these whispered orders left her shaken long after they were given. There was something in the way Camilla delivered them, the steady eye contact, the slight pause afterward, the expectation of complete understanding without clarification, that made Elaine feel complicit in something she could not quite name. The queen never raised her voice, never showed obvious anger, yet her quiet intensity created more pressure than any shouting ever could. Then came the letters. Elaine had expected to handle correspondence as part of her duties, but she had not anticipated the nature of what crossed her desk. These were not the usual royal communications, thank you notes for charitable donations, responses to official invitations, or friendly exchanges with dignitaries. Instead, Camilla entrusted her with confidential letters that arrived in unmarked envelopes, invitations to meetings that appeared on no official calendar, and messages that mandated extraordinary discretion. "These need to be filed in my private office," Camilla would say, handing over sealed envelopes, "not with the regular correspondence, and certainly not where anyone else might accidentally come across them." Elaine found herself managing a shadow system of communication that existed parallel to the official royal channels. She handled letters that Camilla insisted remain completely unseen by certain family members, arrangements for meetings that could never be mentioned to palace staff, and responses to people whose very existence seemed to require secrecy. The weight of these hidden exchanges pressed down on Elaine's shoulders, making her feel like she was carrying secrets that did not belong to her, secrets that made her complicit in deceptions she had never agreed to support. The confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon when autumn rain streaked the palace windows. Elaine had been sorting through documents when she accidentally glimpsed a name on one of the confidential letters, a name she recognized, a name that raised questions she immediately wished she could ask. She must have reacted somehow, perhaps a sharp intake of breath or a moment of hesitation, because when she looked up, Camilla was standing in the doorway watching her with an expression that made Elaine's blood run cold. "Is something troubling you, Elaine?" The question came out soft, almost concerned, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "No, Your Majesty, just focused on the work." Camilla moved closer, her footsteps barely audible on the carpet. "I've noticed you seem uncomfortable lately. Distracted, perhaps? Curious about things that don't concern you?" The words hung in the air like a threat disguised as observation. Elaine felt her throat tighten, understanding suddenly that her discomfort had been visible, that Camilla had been watching her far more closely than she realized. "I would never," Elaine began. "Of course you wouldn't," Camilla interrupted smoothly, "because you understand the importance of discretion, the absolute necessity of loyalty, don't you?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Good, because people who forget that find themselves in very difficult positions. People who ask too many questions, who let curiosity override judgment, they discover that royal service is not the honor they imagined." What final act convinced Elaine it was time to disappear from Camilla's world? The security officer who guarded more than doors. Harold was a man built from routines and principles. He woke every morning at 5:30, ran exactly 4 miles regardless of weather, and arrived at his post 15 minutes early without fail. The first alarm bell rang quietly in Harold's mind on a Thursday evening in late autumn. He had been stationed near the East Wing corridor when he noticed Camilla walking alone through a section of the palace she typically avoided. Nothing inherently suspicious about a queen moving through her own residence, yet something in her body language struck him as wrong. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, her usual composed stride replaced by hurried, almost furtive steps. Her hands clutched her coat tightly despite the palace warmth, and her face carried an expression Harold had seen countless times in his security career, the look of someone trying not to be noticed. Over the following weeks, Harold observed more irregularities. Camilla began taking unexpected late-night walks through corridors that remained dark and empty at those hours. He would see her shadow passing beneath doorways at 2 or 3 in the morning, hear her footsteps echoing through halls where no one else walked. The tension radiating from her during these nocturnal wanderings was palpable, as if she carried something too heavy to bear in daylight hours. Then came the unplanned trips, sudden movements from one wing to another without the usual coordination with security teams, visits to rooms that served no apparent purpose, moments when she would disappear for an hour and emerge looking exhausted or shaken. Harold kept these observations to himself, uncertain what they meant, until he received orders that changed everything. He was assigned to oversee what his supervisor delicately termed classified events, palace activities that mandated heightened discretion and absolute silence. The first such event involved a delivery that arrived long after midnight, brought to a side entrance by people Harold did not recognize. They carried sealed boxes directly to Camilla's private quarters, while Harold maintained watch, ensuring no other staff members witnessed the transaction. The Queen herself appeared briefly, her face pale in the dim lighting, her voice low as she gave instructions Harold could not quite hear. More strange meetings followed. Harold found himself stationed outside rooms where conversations grew heated, where shadows moved against walls in patterns that suggested urgent, emotional exchanges. He witnessed Camilla receiving visitors who arrived and departed through routes designed to avoid security cameras and staff corridors. On 3 separate occasions, he saw her emerge from these encounters with tears threatening to spill, her composure cracking just enough for him to glimpse the pain beneath. Then came the assignment that would haunt Harold for months afterward. His supervisor pulled him aside one morning with explicit instructions delivered in whispers. "There will be a visitor arriving at 3 o'clock this afternoon. You will meet them at the garden entrance. The old one, not the main gate. You will escort them directly to the Queen's study using the back staircase. No other security personnel need to be informed. No logs, no records. This person was never here. Understood?" Harold understood perfectly, which was precisely what troubled him. In 23 years of service, he had never been asked to facilitate a visit that deliberately avoided documentation. Every entrance, every visitor, every movement through the palace existed within carefully maintained systems designed for safety and accountability. Being ordered to circumvent those systems felt wrong in ways he struggled to articulate, yet refusing was not an option. The visitor arrived precisely at 3, a middle-aged woman dressed expensively but simply, her face partially obscured by sunglasses despite the overcast afternoon. She said nothing to Harold, merely nodded when he gestured for her to follow. He led her through the forgotten passages and servant stairs that connected the palace like hidden veins, acutely aware that he was participating in something that mandated this level of secrecy for reasons he could only guess. "Thank you," the woman whispered as he opened the door to Camilla's study. "This meeting never happened." "Of course, ma'am," Harold replied automatically, his training overriding his discomfort. What he heard 2 hours later shattered his carefully maintained professional distance. Harold had been instructed to wait nearby to escort the visitor out the same way she had entered. He positioned himself in an alcove adjacent to the library, close enough to respond if wanted, but far enough to provide privacy. The walls of the old palace, however, were not built for modern conversations, and sound traveled through the ancient stone in unexpected ways. Voices reached him through the library doors, Camilla's voice, unmistakable even when raised, and another voice responding with equal intensity. Harold could not make out specific words, but the emotion was crystal clear. Anger, desperation, fear, all twisted together in tones that made his chest tighten with vicarious pain. Then he heard something that made him freeze completely, Camilla's voice cracking, breaking apart in a way he had never heard from anyone in the royal family. It was raw grief, unfiltered anguish, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed defenses had finally collapsed under unbearable weight. "Please," he heard her say, the single word carrying such desperate pleading that Harold felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred and terrible. He stood there unable to move, unable to unhear what he had just witnessed, unable to reconcile this broken voice with the composed queen he had protected for years. When the visitor finally emerged, her face was streaked with tears, and she hurried past Harold without acknowledging his presence. He escorted her out in complete silence, both of them trapped in the weight of whatever had just occurred. What truth did he fear would be erased if he said nothing? The Queen's desperate control. The transformation accelerated after the incidents that Harold and Elaine had witnessed. Camilla began implementing changes throughout the palace with an urgency that bordered on frantic. She approached her position with renewed determination, as if tightening her grip on every detail might somehow prevent the past from reaching into her carefully constructed present. Staff members noticed the shift immediately. The Queen, who had been gradually settling into her role, suddenly became intensely focused on controlling not just her own image, but the entire environment surrounding her. The reassignment started without warning. Long-serving staff members found themselves transferred to different wings or different duties entirely, their years of experience dismissed with polite explanations that fooled no one. Camilla was systematically removing people who had been present during certain periods, replacing them with newer employees who carried no memories of uncomfortable moments or difficult transitions. A housekeeper who had worked in the private quarters for 15 years suddenly found herself managing guest suites. A secretary who had handled sensitive correspondence was reassigned to public relations. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Camilla was creating distance between herself and those who might have witnessed things she preferred forgotten. Certain rooms became completely off-limits. Doors that had previously stood open now remained locked, their keys held by only a select few. Camilla ordered entire sections of the palace closed for what she called renovations, though no construction crews ever appeared. Staff whispered about the sealed chambers, wondering what they contained, that mandated such extreme protection? Was it documents, photographs, evidence of something that could not be allowed to resurface? Then came the formation of her inner circle, a small group of advisors chosen with surgical precision. These were not the traditional royal counselors or experienced palace officials. Instead, Camilla selected individuals based on different criteria entirely. Their loyalty was absolute, their discretion proven, their willingness to prioritize her interests above all else without question. She met with them privately, often late at night, in rooms where even trusted staff were not permitted to enter. "I need people I can depend on completely," she told her closest advisor during one such meeting, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. "People who understand that my stability is everyone's stability." This inner circle became her shield and her weapon. They managed information flow, controlled access to the Queen, and handled situations that mandated what they delicately termed sensitive management. Through them, Camilla extended her influence into areas traditionally outside royal control, monitoring conversations, tracking staff movements, and ensuring that certain topics never reached public discussion. The palace, which had always operated with some degree of transparency among its workers, began to feel like a place of shadows and whispers. The clash with another royal came unexpectedly, erupting during what should have been a routine family gathering. The details remained guarded, known only to those present, but the aftermath rippled through the palace like aftershocks from an earthquake. Staff members who served during the event emerged looking shaken, speaking in hushed tones about raised voices and slammed doors. What shocked everyone most was not that a disagreement had occurred. Royal families argued like any other, but that Camilla had stood her ground with such fierce intensity. "This is not negotiable," witnesses heard her say, her voice carrying through walls despite her obvious attempts to maintain privacy. "I have earned my place here, and I will not be undermined by anyone. Not anymore." The other royal had apparently challenged some decision Camilla had made, questioning her authority in a matter she considered settled. The confrontation revealed something those close to her had begun to suspect. Beneath her composed exterior lived a woman who felt constantly under threat, who interpreted even innocent disagreements as attacks on her legitimacy. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, endured too many years of public contempt to allow anyone, even family, to question her position now. But the aggressive defense of her status betrayed something deeper than mere pride. Fear had begun to consume her, growing more intense with each passing week. Camilla started seeing threats everywhere, in casual conversations between staff members, in the way certain people looked at her, in requests for access to old records or photographs. She became convinced that her past was not as buried as she had believed, that actions she thought safely hidden might somehow resurface to destroy everything she had finally achieved. The paranoia manifested in increasingly strange behaviors. She would stop mid-conversation, distracted by thoughts only she could hear. During public appearances, her smile seemed more forced, her laughter more hollow, as if part of her remained elsewhere, constantly vigilant for approaching danger. She began questioning staff about their conversations, demanding to know who had spoken to whom, about what. The sweet woman who had once existed beneath the crown was being slowly devoured by the fear of exposure. Her most trusted advisor noticed the deterioration and attempted to address it gently one evening. "Your Majesty, perhaps you're being too cautious. Perhaps the past is more settled than you fear." Camilla turned to her with eyes that reflected something close to panic. "You don't understand. There are things that cannot come to light, things that would destroy not just me but everything. I wake up every night thinking about it, wondering if today will be the day someone discovers what I've worked so hard to keep buried." "What specifically are you afraid of?" the advisor asked carefully, but Camilla would not answer. She simply shook her head and looked away, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the arms of her chair. What memory kept resurfacing, no matter how hard she pushed it down? When silence became impossible. Jennifer had spent her entire life believing in second chances and the goodness buried deep within people. She was the sort of woman who stopped to help strangers with heavy groceries, who volunteered at shelters on weekends, and who sent handwritten notes to friends just to remind them they were loved. Her colleagues at the palace had adored her gentle nature, the way she never participated in cruel gossip, how she defended people when others criticized them behind their backs. The gathering began with a phone call that Jennifer almost did not answer. The number was unfamiliar, and she had grown cautious about unexpected contact after leaving the palace. But something made her pick up, and on the other end was a voice she had not heard in 3 years. Catherine, who had served as assistant to the household manager during the same period Jennifer had been there. "I know this is strange," Catherine said, her words tumbling out quickly as if she feared losing courage. "But I've been thinking about our time there, and I wondered if you also felt like something was very wrong." The relief in Jennifer's chest was so intense it actually hurt. "Yes," she whispered, "every single day." They met for lunch in a quiet restaurant 2 towns away from anything connected to royal life. Within an hour they had contacted others, people who had left the palace during the same troubled years, employees who had departed quietly without fanfare or explanation. The invitations were careful, coded with language that only those who had lived through similar experiences would understand. "Would you like to talk about our time in service?" meant so much more than the simple words suggested. 7 people assembled in a private room at a small hotel, chosen specifically because no one there would recognize them or care about their conversation. Jennifer arrived early, her stomach churning with nervousness and anticipation. She watched as others entered, faces she remembered from palace corridors, people who had once shared her daily world. Catherine came with her husband for moral support. There was Peter, who had coordinated maintenance schedules, and Linda, who had managed guest accommodations. James arrived looking older than Jennifer remembered, the strain of carrying unspoken truths evident in the lines around his eyes. Sophie, who had been one of the youngest staff members during her brief tenure, showed up last, clearly reluctant but unable to stay away. For the first hour, they simply talked about their lives since leaving. New jobs, family updates, the ordinary details that people share when reconnecting. But the real reason for their gathering pressed against every polite conversation, demanding acknowledgement. Finally, Catherine set down her coffee cup and said what everyone was thinking. "We all left for the same reason, didn't we? We all saw things that made staying impossible." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Then, slowly, people began to speak. Peter described how he had been ordered to disable security cameras in certain corridors during specific times, creating blind spots that made him deeply uncomfortable. When he questioned the instruction, he was told it was a matter of privacy for sensitive royal discussions. But the pattern of when and where these blackouts occurred suggested something far less innocent. "I was told those cameras malfunctioned naturally," Peter said, his voice tight with residual anger. "But I was the one turning them off. I was the one creating gaps in the security record, and I didn't fully understand why until much later." Linda spoke about guest records she had been instructed to alter, removing names from official logs while maintaining separate, hidden documentation that only Camilla could access. She described being called into the Queen's office and given explicit directions about which visitors wanted to be erased from palace history. "She made it sound so reasonable," Linda recalled. "She said some guests valued absolute privacy, that discretion was a hallmark of good service. But the secrecy felt wrong, the hidden records felt wrong. And when I expressed even slight hesitation, her entire demeanor changed. The warmth disappeared, and I saw someone capable of real cruelty." James revealed that he had been present during financial discussions that troubled him deeply, expenditures that seemed to serve personal rather than official purposes, money flowing through channels designed to obscure its ultimate destination. When he quietly suggested that proper accounting procedures should be followed, he found himself suddenly facing performance reviews that questioned his competence and loyalty. Sophie, who had been barely 22 when she worked at the palace, spoke in a voice so quiet the others had to lean forward to hear her. She described being assigned to organize Camilla's personal correspondence and discovering letters that referenced events and relationships that contradicted the official narrative the Queen presented to the world. When Sophie accidentally mentioned seeing these letters during a conversation with another staff member, she was summoned immediately. "I had never been so frightened in my life," Sophie said. tears gathering in her eyes despite the years that had passed. The way she looked at me, it wasn't anger exactly, but something colder. But she asked me what I had said, to whom, and what I thought I knew. Then she told me that people who could not be trusted with sensitive information had no place in royal service. I was gone within a week. As each person shared their experience, a pattern became impossible to ignore. These were not random incidents or personality conflicts. Camilla had been systematically controlling information, manipulating records, intimidating staff, and removing anyone who might threaten her carefully constructed version of reality. The scope of it stunned everyone in the room. How many people had been affected, how many years this had continued, how expertly she had maintained the deception. Then Jennifer shared the incident that had driven her from the palace, the event that still haunted her dreams. It involved a young assistant named Emma, a sweet girl fresh from university, who had been thrilled to work in such a prestigious environment. Emma had been assigned to help organize archived materials, sorting through old documents and photographs from previous years. During this work, she discovered something, Jennifer never learned exactly what, that clearly had significant implications. Emma had approached Jennifer in distress, unsure what to do with information that seemed important, but also dangerous. Before Jennifer could advise her, Emma was called to meet with Camilla privately. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Emma emerged looking devastated, her face drained of color, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "She wouldn't tell me what happened," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "She just kept saying she had made a terrible mistake, that she should never have looked at things that were not her concern. She left the palace that same afternoon and never came back. I tried to contact her afterward, but she changed her number and moved away. I failed her by not protecting her, by not understanding sooner what we were all dealing with." Every person in that room had been affected by what happened to Emma. They had all witnessed her distress, felt their own fear intensify, understood that speaking out carried consequences they were not prepared to face. The guilt of having stayed silent while a young woman suffered had eaten at each of them differently, but the weight was shared. The decision to come forward developed organically from their conversation. There was no dramatic declaration, no single moment of resolution. Instead, a quiet consensus emerged that silence had protected Camilla long enough, that their complicity through fear had to end, that Emma and others like her deserved to have someone acknowledge the truth of what had been done to them. "I'm not doing this for revenge," Catherine said firmly. "I'm doing this because the truth matters more than my comfort." "I'm doing this for Emma," Jennifer added, "and for every other person who was hurt and had nowhere to turn." They understood the risks. Speaking against a queen meant facing scrutiny, doubt, accusations of ulterior motives. They would be called liars, opportunists, bitter former employees with axes to grind. Their characters would be attacked, their memories questioned, their motives dissected publicly. The palace had resources and influence they could never match, but their deepest fear was not about what would happen to them. They were afraid that speaking would accomplish nothing, that Camilla's power was too great, that the truth would be dismissed or buried just as effectively as all the evidence she had already destroyed. They feared that breaking their silence would expose them to harm without achieving any justice, that their suffering would increase while the situation remained unchanged. What were they afraid would happen once the truth left their lips? Camilla's reckoning. Camilla had once been fearless in her capacity to love. In her youth, she threw herself into relationships with complete abandon, trusted people with her whole heart, and believed that passion could overcome any obstacle society placed in its path. She had been witty and charming at dinner parties, genuinely interested in the lives of people around her, capable of making anyone feel like the most important person in the room. Even in her complexity, even with all her flaws, there existed within her a real desire to be loved and to love in return. She was not a villain from a storybook, not inherently cruel or calculating. She was a woman who had made choices, some wise, some desperate, some irreversible, and who had spent decades trying to outrun the consequences of those choices. Now, sitting alone in her private chambers, she was learning that no amount of control or manipulation could keep the past buried forever. The confessions began quietly, appearing first in a carefully researched news article that treated the former employee's accounts with seriousness and respect. The journalist had verified details, cross-referenced timelines, and presented the information not as scandal, but as documented pattern of behavior spanning multiple years. Within days, the story spread across the kingdom like wildfire catching dry grass. People who had previously dismissed concerns about Camilla's character could no longer ignore the specificity of the allegations, the number of witnesses, the consistency of their stories. Margaret spoke about the culture of fear that had permeated the household, the systematic removal of staff who asked uncomfortable questions. Harold described the secret visitor, the hidden meetings, the sound of the Queen's voice breaking behind closed doors in ways that suggested she carried guilt that haunted her. Elaine detailed the shadow communication system, the letters that could never be officially acknowledged, the pressure to become complicit in deceptions she had never agreed to support. Peter revealed the disabled security cameras, Linda the altered guest records, James the suspicious financial arrangements, but it was the story of Emma that captured public attention most powerfully. The young woman who had discovered something so threatening that Camilla had driven her from the palace in traumatized silence became a symbol of all the people who had been hurt and silenced over the years. The fact that Emma herself remained unreachable, apparently still too frightened to speak even years later, made the story more heartbreaking and damning. The kingdom reacted with shock that quickly transformed into demands for accountability. How had this been allowed to continue for so long? Why had no one in positions of authority noticed or intervened? What exactly was Camilla hiding that mandated such extensive efforts at concealment and control? In her private chambers, Camilla received the news in waves, each new revelation hitting her like physical blows. Her closest advisors tried to manage the crisis, crafting statements and responses, but she barely heard their strategic suggestions. She dismissed them all finally, needing to be alone with what was happening, needing to face without performance or pretense the complete collapse of everything she had fought to build. She stood before the full-length mirror in her dressing room, the same mirror where she had practiced her public smile countless times, where she had adjusted her crown and checked her appearance before facing cameras and crowds. Now she looked at herself without the armor of title or position, just a woman whose secrets had finally escaped her grasp. Her reflection showed the physical toll of years spent in constant vigilance. The lines around her eyes had deepened from sleepless nights. Her mouth held tension even in repose. Her shoulders carried permanent tightness from the weight of hidden truths. She reached up to touch her face, as if seeing herself clearly for the first time in decades. "Who am I without all of this?" she whispered to her reflection. "What's left when everything I tried to protect is gone?" The tears came then. Not the controlled tears she had perfected for public sympathy, but raw grief for the life she had imagined versus the reality she had created. She had wanted to be loved, to be accepted, to take her rightful place, and finally rest in security and respect. Instead, she had built her position on foundations of fear and manipulation, and now those foundations were crumbling beneath her. The summons came the following morning. A senior royal, one whose opinion still carried weight, whose judgment could influence her future, requested a private meeting. Camilla dressed carefully, instinctively reaching for the dignity that appearance could provide, then stopped herself. What was the point of performance now? They met in a small sitting room, away from staff and formal protocols. The senior royal sat in silence for a long moment, studying Camilla with an expression that mixed disappointment, concern, and something that might have been pity. "I need you to help me understand," the senior royal finally said, voice quiet but firm. "Help me understand how we arrived at this moment." Camilla felt her throat tighten. "I was afraid," she said simply. "From the very beginning, I was afraid that I would never truly belong, that people would never accept me, that my past would always define me. So I tried to control everything, the narrative, the evidence, the people who might speak against me. I thought if I could just manage it all carefully enough, I could create a version of reality that would allow me to survive. But at what cost? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. At the cost of my integrity, Camilla admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. At the cost of people's trust and safety. At the cost of young staff members who deserve protection, not intimidation. I told myself I was doing what was necessary, that the ends justified the means, but I was really just protecting myself at everyone else's expense. The senior royal leaned forward slightly. The staff who came forward, they described someone who became increasingly paranoid, increasingly willing to hurt others to maintain control. Is that who you wanted to become? No, Camilla said, tears spilling down her cheeks. That was never who I wanted to be. But fear changes people. It changed me into someone I barely recognize. What were you so afraid would be discovered? What truth justified all of this? Camilla looked away, the final confession sticking in her throat. But silence had caused enough damage. That I didn't deserve this position. That my path here caused too much pain to too many people. That no matter what I achieved, I would always be defined by how I got here rather than what I did once I arrived. I spent so much energy trying to control that narrative that I lost sight of actually being worthy of the respect I so desperately wanted. The conversation lasted 2 hours, ranging across years of decisions and consequences. The senior royal did not offer easy forgiveness or simple solutions. Instead, there was honest reckoning with the harm done, the lives affected, the trust broken. When it ended, Camilla understood that her future had fundamentally changed. There would be investigations, questions she would have to answer publicly, consequences she could not manipulate or control. Her position might survive, but it would never be comfortable again. The respect she had craved would remain forever out of reach, tainted by what had been revealed. In the days that followed, Camilla faced a kingdom that viewed her through new eyes. Public appearances became exercises in endurance, every smile questioned, every gesture analyzed for authenticity. The privacy she had fought so hard to protect was gone, replaced by scrutiny more intense than anything she had experienced before. But in the quiet moments alone, something unexpected emerged. Without the constant effort of maintaining false narratives, without the exhausting vigilance mandated to suppress truth, Camilla found a strange kind of relief. The worst had happened. Her secrets were known, her methods exposed, her carefully constructed image shattered, and yet she was still here, still breathing, still existing beyond the control she had thought was essential to survival. She began writing letters to those she had harmed, not for public consumption or image management, but for her own conscience. Most went unanswered. Some were returned unopened. But the act of acknowledging what she had done, of attempting amends however inadequate, felt like the first honest thing she had done in years.